We've lost everyone but the millennials, and even they're sick of us. Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game controversy to my friends.
I'm Elford Stevens, fellow video game lover.
And I'm Phil Thomas, relatively new to PS4 games like Monster Hunter and Diablo 3, so you can consider me a video game newbie.
We are going to be talking about the 1997 PC game Postal, the controversy behind it, and the fascinating group of individuals who have brought this game to the world of gaming. Question for the group, has anybody ever heard of Postal?
I had never heard of Postal before we started this podcast.
Yeah, same here.
Anybody want to guess what this game would be about?
You know when, as a kid, you want to send away for a toy that's on a cereal box, and then you have to clip off all the postal codes that are like on the bottom flap of the box? I think it's a video game about that, like trying to eat as much cereal as you can, and then send away for like one of those like Matchbox cards. No?
Send all those box tops in, right?
Yeah.
Just from the nature of this podcast, I'm thinking that this Postal game must be very interesting.
So Postal is an isometric shooter developed by a company called Running with Scissors and originally published by Ripcord Games. In the game, you play as a dude, very creatively named the Postal Dude. He gets evicted from his house in the small town of Paradise, Arizona, and the rational and clear-headed guy that he is, the Postal Dude decides to go on a murderous rampage, tearing his way through 17 levels and mowing down anybody who gets in his way. In every stage, the Postal Dude needs to kill a certain percentage of people. While enemies such as police and military try to stop him, there are also people designated as civilians, which you can deal with as you like. The dude has access to a diverse arsenal of weapons to dispatch his would-be dispatchers and unarmed civilians, including machine guns, grenades, rocket launchers, and even napalm. And of course, the objective is to try to do this without the Postal Dude getting, killed himself. Although, fun fact, there is a dedicated suicide button in this game. So here's our back-of-the-box description of Postal. Welcome to Paradise, Arizona. They're out to get you, or are they? It doesn't matter. You don't have time to think, only time to kill. Go Postal! Blast, maim, and firebomb your way through 17 unsuspecting locales from a small town to a heavily guarded military complex. Conspiracy or insanity. Don't get too crazy. This killing spree is anything but senseless. Out here, strategy is key and the locals are packing. So take advantage of the third-person premeditated perspective that lets you see exactly who's cold and who's still able to pull a trigger. Features listed on the back of the box include the need to use strategy to gain advantage in shootouts, real-time 3D characters, multiplayer, and a level editor, and of course, the opportunity to just lay waste to everyone around you, promising an experience that is, quote, so freaking real. Your victims actually beg for mercy and scream for their lives, with plenty of, quote, mass murder opportunities, spray protesters, mow down marching bands, and charbroil whole towns. Thoughts?
You know, when you play a video game, there are some kind of constraints, right, that you're fighting against. Description sounds like you're just mowing down people. So I'm wondering, what's the challenge exactly?
Well, they set you up by saying the people of Paradise are out to get you. Or are they? And so it makes you wonder, okay, I guess maybe there's going to be some mystery as to why you are fighting here. It doesn't go further into the story all that much, but rather describes the fact that you're going to be in a shooting game, which a lot of games are going to have shooting and throwing bombs and launching missiles. So it does set you up to think that maybe there's something going on with a story, with the idea of there's possibly a conspiracy going on.
So the objective of this game is you go through various locales, including things like a suburban neighborhood, a construction site, a city, a military base, and you have a certain percentage of people that you need to kill to advance. And once you do that, you move on, you do it again for 16 levels. So let's use that as a segue to talk about exactly what this game is, who made this game, and kind of what the fuss was about over it. For Vincent J. Desiderio Jr., the road to video games was anything but straightforward. Born in Brooklyn on May 21st, 1953, Vince took on a bunch of different jobs during the 1970s and early 80s. These included a teacher, New York cab driver, nightclub promoter, and Wall Street headhunter. While working on Wall Street, in fact, his boss convinced him to change his name to something less aggressively Brooklyn Italian, and he started calling himself Vince Desi, and that's what I'm going to call him for the rest of this story. In the early 80s, Desi took a job that would shape the rest of his professional life: talent agent to the tech industry. He formed his own talent agency called Desi Network Inc., or DNI, and he tried to make a name for himself representing game designers and programmers. And in 1982, while working with Atari, he met a fellow New Yorker named Mike Riedel. Riedel's path to video games was much more straightforward than Desi's. After a brief stint at the Rochester Institute of Technology, Riedel started working as a freelance game designer. And during one such stint at Atari, he met Desi, and the two started a professional relationship. In 1986, Riedel formed his own work-for-hire game company he called Riedel Software Productions, or RSP. Desi originally acted as Riedel's agent. However, the two eventually went into business together, and in 1991, Desi became a managing partner at RSP, with him handling the business side of things while Riedel and eventually a small staff handling the programming side. That same year in 1991, Desi convinced Riedel to get out of New York, and they relocated the company from New York City to Tucson, Arizona. Over the next 10 years, RSP carved a niche in children's educational games and games based on TV brands, developing relationships with such companies as the World Wrestling Federation, the Walt Disney Company, Hanna-Barbera, Warner Brothers, and the Children's Television Workshop. Some of RSP's noteworthy titles during this period included 2 NES games based on Sesame Street, also Micro League Wrestling, which, fun fact, was the first video game to bear the WWF license, and also a bunch of games based on TV brands like the Looney Tunes, Chippendale's Rescue Rangers, the Beetlejuice cartoon, Bobby's World, and even a video game based on the movie Beethoven. You remember Beethoven?
Yes.
So let's skip ahead a little bit. We're going to skip to 1996. And after a decade of working for hire on kids' games, the guys at RSP were looking for a change of pace. Riedel and Desi split RSP into 2 entities that they called the Production Services Group and the Original Programming Group. The Production Services Group was run by Riedel, and this kept up the basic day-to-day operations of RSP, so continuing that work-for-hire license game business that I briefly talked about. Stuff like working like with Sesame Street and Looney Tunes and all that. Desi got to run the Original Programming Group. And the goal of this new division was to develop original IP for RSP, so going outside of licensing the stuff that was developed in-house. According to RSP's website in 1998, the Original Programming Group's goal was to, quote, create games which push the envelope and offer great playability and real learning experiences. Desi, though, had a clear vision for the new division. Get as far away from Daffy Duck P.I., the case of the missing letters, and Big Bird's hide and speak as humanly possible. He wanted to take RSP's games into new, transgressive, edgy directions. But Original Programming Group is hardly a sexy name for a company determined to push the boundaries of taste. So Desi thought of a new name, Running with Scissors. When asked about the name, he told a Wall Street Journal reporter in 1997, quote, we wanted to come up with something that we felt good about, that also got the message across. What did your mother tell you to do when you were a kid? Don't run with scissors.
I like that name, Running with Scissors. Let's see where they go with it.
You might ask what prompted this change in direction. So going from like more kids games to more edgy games. And reports at the time offer a couple of different, what I think are all equally likely explanations. It probably was a combination of them. First off, the guys at RSP were just sick of making kids games. I mean, when you're staring into the abyss, sometimes the abyss stares back and says, hey, Bobo. That's a Bobby's World reference for all you 90s kids out there.
I'm having to reach for that one. I'm reaching really far.
We've lost everyone but the millennials, and even they're sick of us. Another possible reason is that Desi and Riedel felt the market for educational games and licensed children's games was starting to get smaller, so they wanted to diversify and sort of broaden their revenue streams. I think an also likely explanation was that over the past few years, leading up to 1996, RSP got burned on a couple of relatively high-profile licensed game deals. So, for example, RSP was supposed to make a version of Donkey Kong for the Philips CDI, and that fell through. Another was reportedly a Free Willy game that never came to pass. We are hitting all of the early 90s references. Remember Free Willy?
Definitely.
So, Kevin, you may have to cut this later, but is Postal about O.J. Simpson? Because that would be another, if we were just going to tie all of the 90s references together.
I am so glad you asked. Occasionally, the Postal dude will shoot out one-liners because he's trying to be funny. One of these so-called jokes is just he yells, O.J. And it's just like, I guess just because it's a timely 90s reference. Because when was the O.J. Simpson trial? 94, right?
It was 96.
Okay. It was super relevant for when they're making this game in 1996. So yeah, you asked about O.J. Simpson. Yes, there is an O.J. reference.
Oh my God.
So we talked about licensed games that fell through: Donkey Kong for the CDI, the Free Willy game, and my favorite, or probably has the most interesting, is a Steven Seagal-based game called Steven Seagal Is the Final Option.
Nice.
Which is a Steven Seagal-based 2D beat 'em up for the Super Nintendo that got pretty far into development before getting scrapped. There is actually a semi-working prototype of it that circulated around the internet. So it's possible that these deals falling through might have been one of the reasons why they decided to go into original programming. So it's 1996, and you're ready to stake your claim in the competitive games market. How do you stand out in the crowd while also breaking away from all that kid stuff that defined your studio for a decade? How about a game about a mass shooter tearing his way through an Arizona town? Now, let me be clear. Making a violent video game in 1996 is far from a revolutionary idea. Games such as Mortal Kombat in 1992 and Doom in 1993 have become breakaway hits due in part to their transgressive violence, and their successes inspired legions of imitators determined to make bank on video game violence. Moreover, the creation of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board in 1994, which I promise will be a future episode, specifically the M for mature rating, helped cultivate a market specifically targeting adults while potentially shielding game makers from legal reprisal or government censorship. I mean, why is 12-year-old Aloysius having a copy of M-rated Bone Storm or whatever, you know?
Bone Storm.
Running with Scissors hoped to stand out from the imitators by shifting the violence to a contemporary setting. A lot of the games of the time had abstracted the violence in like sci-fi or fantasy, and they wanted to strip away any highfalutin motivations like saving the world. So they wanted to focus on a dude who was unhinged and mad at the world and is determined to make every person who gets in his way a smear on the sidewalk. As Desi explained in a GamePro interview in 2010, quote, "We wanted to get away from the whole I play a soldier who's in space saving the world. They say there's only 7 scripts in Hollywood. In the video game industry, there's about 1.5.
That's an interesting criticism.
With the hook in place, all it needed was a title. Something snappy, something edgy, something mid-1990s. Running with Scissors employee Steve Wick later recalled an early name that Desi considered was The Last Nail, telling Patrick Shaw of GamePro in 2010, quote, "Vince initially came up with the idea of calling it The Last Nail, which had a cool crucifixion vibe to it. However, they ultimately went with another name for their game about a person who goes on a murderous rampage, one that was way more ripped from the headlines than The Last Nail." On October the 21st, 1996, RSP filed a trademark with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office for a, quote, "computer game software, video game software, and or virtual reality game software named Postal." Wick explained the thought process behind the name to Patrick Shaw of GamePro, saying, quote, "There was a game for 3DO called PO'd, and I thought all the good days must be taken if that's what we're down to. I figured there must be some word in the lexicon to sum up the kind of game we were making, and then I heard someone say, whoa, that guy went postal. I knew that was it. It summed up what the game was and the kind of experience we're going for." And it's at this point, I feel like I need to step back for a second and offer some context. And Elford, Phil, are either of you familiar with the expression going postal?
Okay, I'm going to tell you what I think, Phil. You say what you think, because I'm not an expert on about anything. But when I think of the term going postal, I'm thinking of the few incidents we've had in our country where you've had postal workers who have taken weapons into their job and have fired them on people. Going postal, just kind of blatantly due to some underlying issues, just deciding you're going to try to execute people with your weapons.
Yeah, I agree. That was my understanding of the genesis of it. And I would essentially say it's what we now call an active shooter situation. Going postal is when you have an active shooter.
The U.S. is the only country I'm familiar with, and we do have this festering epidemic where we have these issues, and it's very political, but we have issues where now everybody needs to be aware of active shooters. And I guess the going postal is generally a phrase you place on somebody based on just them expressing their feelings through violence this way.
You know, that's interesting, Elford, because I think the term going postal puts the onus on the perpetrator going crazy and doing something sensational. And then active shooter now gives you this connotation like somebody's having a seizure or a tantrum and we all just need to let it happen. Just, all right, everybody, we've got an active shooter. Just, you know. Let him have his space.
So yeah, that sums it up pretty well. For the benefit of our listeners who did not live through the 1990s, the term refers to a person who is driven to violence, usually due to extreme stress. And
that's a good way to say it, yeah.
As you pointed out, Elford, it originated in a response to a series of shootings that were committed at post offices by U.S. postal employees during the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, while this was not the first incident, the earliest postal-related mass shooting to receive widespread public attention took place on August the 20th, 1986, when a part-time letter carrier named Patrick Henry Sherrill opened fire at the Edmond, Oklahoma post office where he worked, killing 14 and wounding several others before turning the gun on himself. It was the largest mass shooting in the history of the state of Oklahoma, and at the time was the third largest mass shooting in U.S. history, a record Americans have been depressingly determined to continue to break. In December 1993, after several other workplace shootings involving postal employees prompted investigations, a reporter for the St. Petersburg Times introduced the term going postal to describe the incidents. The explanations behind this thing go way beyond the scope of this podcast, but I'll put some resources in the description where people can learn more about the history of going postal. But in some cases, the people who committed them had prior documented histories of violent or erratic behavior or untreated mental health issues. Cheryl, for example, was by all accounts an angry loner with a long prior history of harassment against women and an uncomfortable amount of access to guns. Investigations also revealed a pervasive and systemic toxic work environment within the United States Postal Service that may have also played a role in creating high stress situations. Regardless, the term going postal stuck in the popular lexicon, and the image of the disgruntled postal worker became a pervasive figure in 1990s American popular culture to the point that it became a punchline. Think of Newman from Seinfeld as like the most well-known example of this sort of disgruntled postal worker. But it was everywhere. It was in kid shows. I remember watching Rocko's Modern Life, and there's a joke in there at one point where a bunch of people are on a subway train, and this guy in the middle is dressed in a postal uniform. He says, ever since I got fired from the post office, I've been feeling a little disgruntled. And a bunch of people avoid him and they get away. So like we're even having jokes about mass shootings in our cartoons. Way to go, America. Getting back to Running with Scissors. With their game idea and provocative title in place, how do you market a game like this? Why, you try to trigger a controversy, of course. You may recall a few episodes ago, we covered Custer's Revenge. And you remember the hypothesis that I offered that American Multiple Industries, the guys who made Custer's Revenge, probably put out a bunch of stuff to troll the media into fermenting it like a marketing-friendly controversy. Mm-hmm. That is Running with Scissors' entire bag. From the jump, they're trying to troll the media into covering them so they get a whole bunch of free publicity. So, for example, on March the 20th, 1997, Running with Scissors put out its first press release introducing Postal to the world, issuing a statement that opened thusly, quote, Running with Scissors, the world's most dangerous software developer, announces the world's most dangerous game, Postal, for the PC and Mac. The recently launched brand label of veteran developers RSP Incorporated warns that this is about mayhem, not mail sorting. Running with Scissors' marketing was determined to let everyone know that they were the baddest bunch of badasses that ever made a video game, and their video game was the edgiest, most extreme game ever created. The rest of the press release copy goes on to describe the game's over-the-top 90s attitude in practically Poochie-esque terms. Quote, how postal is Postal? To the extreme, bras and sisters. According to veteran electronic entertainment journalist and game designer Bill Kunkel, this is definitely not your little brother's computer game. I'm not even sure it is a game in the traditional sense. There's no point-style performance evaluation, for example. It's really more of a situational simulation. But what a situation! This game theoretically represents as much of a shock to the software entertainment system as Pulp Fiction did to the world of cinema. Wow, Postal's one outrageous game is totally in my face.
I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out. I'm wondering if this market strategy is going to be more effective for Postal.
And so this continued for a while. Between March the 20th and May the 2nd, 1997, Running with Scissors published weekly press releases expounding on their super extreme violent game made by the coolest dudes in the business who are definitely not compensated for anything now that you mention it. For example, On April 17th, they announced another preface release, the launch of their website, proclaiming Postal was, quote, a software trauma that literally stretches the envelope in terms of sophisticated plotting and on-screen violence, adding, this warped brainchild of a badass development team led by veteran Mike Riddell has created a cult-like fascination based entirely on a few screenshots and some incredible buzz. So thoughts so far?
Man, it must have been rough to try to put out a video game in the 80s and 90s because, I mean, the comparison between then and today being that companies are desperate to get any type of press because press is the only way they can introduce a new game without there being some type of other groundswell of support. So what I see is people appealing to the lowest common denominator, whereas today people simply don't have to do that. We have so many more ways where they can reach customers directly, and they can do that based on the merits of the game and not because the only way to get press is through doing something sensational.
We also have a more sophisticated population of gamers these days. Although technology keeps expanding, like the leaps in technology from 1980 to 2000 were enormous in terms of what they could do with these games. And so there's so much more that the average gamer, who is much older now, knows about games versus back then.
Yeah, we're so much more sophisticated now. It's not like, back in the 90s, we had Doom, and it's not like, they just put out new versions of Doom every year.
Capitalism breeds innovation.
But you're also talking about two different markets, because you've got a market of people purchasing games who are actually critiquing them or downloading demos or basing their purchases off of trusted advice from reviewers. And then you still have your market of gamers who simply purchase just a few titles, FIFA title, first-person shooter that everybody's playing that year. And that is all advertising and branding versus anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, Elford. I mean, clearly I was making a joke about Doom. People bought Doom in the 90s, maybe based on voyeurism. People would buy Doom today based on nostalgia. And there's obviously a much bigger video game market for things like Farmville and FIFA. And Madden and all sorts of stuff.
I want you to hold on to that thought about niche audiences. It's going to be a big characteristic when we talk about Postal going forward, and especially when we get to its sequel, which we're not going to talk about today, but I want you to keep that in the back of your mind because we are going to go back to that specific point too.
I will say I do have a couple of questions at this point, Kevin. Okay. Not that you need to answer them right now, but as the listener, what I'm thinking about is, wait a minute, why? Why did you want to make a game that's not, for kids or educational or heavily moralistic? And why this game? I mean, are you trying to get rich, or do you have rage issues, or what? Like, what's the impetus for this game and this concept?
That's a great question. There are some people who assume that this is what all gaming was in the 1990s and sort of extreme, aggressive. Some people came out of Doom and said, we need to do more like Doom. And I think to some extent, maybe they thought that this will attract enough attention. This will get, the sort of mainstream audience, not the gamers themselves, but to get the mainstream press really incensed. Think of Night Trap. I wonder if they looked at what happened with Night Trap, because Night Trap was a nothing game. Sales figures before the hearings in 1993 said maybe it sold about 100,000 copies. It's a really small success, but it skyrockets into the national scene. All of a sudden, this nothing FMV game that could have came and went alongside Ground Zero Texas and Crisscross Make My Video and was public enemy number one and had so much attention and eventually got to be re-released on other systems. And the fact that we have a 25th anniversary of this goddamn game now, and I wonder if they're thinking about this is we can kind of try to trick the sort of people who don't understand gaming and have them look at this game. It might be that.
Just a quick point based on what you said. My question would be, are they trying to drum up press for the game, or are they trying to drum up press for their own company? At some point, they say, my bad, I guess that was a horrible idea, but check out X totally reasonable game. And then people buy that because now they are a more prominent company, for better or worse.
I don't think it was a situation where here's this extreme game and here's this less extreme alternative. This was it. This was it for them, was Postal. This was their first foray into all of this. And it's just, by all accounts, these guys are determined to get somebody to pay attention to them. Almost as if they're shouting to the public, don't you want to get offended by our controversial video game? Oh, gee, it would really suck if someone made a real big deal about this. Wink, wink. And Running with Scissors' shameless efforts to trick the media into reporting on their software trauma of a game, conveniently named after a trendy media term associated with mass shootings, quickly paid off in April 1997 when Postal received a denunciation from the most likeliest of sources, the United States Postal Service. In early April 1997, Postmaster General Marvin Runyon sent a letter to Running with Scissors asking them to reconsider the name. The letter read in part, quote, "All of us at the Postal Service have a sense of humor, but there's nothing funny about your game Postal. It is in very poor taste, and it's an enormous and unfair portrayal of the nation's postal employees. I believe you owe the men and women of the Postal Service an apology, and hope you will have enough common sense to discontinue the postal game." And the Postal Service also reportedly threatened to sue Running with Scissors. More on that in a few minutes. You can see the Postal Service's perspective on the way the term going postal has gotten into the popular lexicon, and it becomes like a game of whack-a-mole where they're trying to stamp down anything that's capitalizing on this whole going postal thing. Now, Postal didn't have any postal employees in it, ultimately, and Running with Scissors was determined to point that out whenever anybody asked, and even when they didn't. But they're also definitely trying to capitalize on this thing. And far from apologizing, on April the 24th, 1997, Running with Scissors put out another press release bragging that their awesome violent video game was so extreme that even the U.S. Postal Service felt it was too much for audiences, saying, quote, "The game company that created the envelope shredding letter bomb of a software trauma called Postal has now drawn the ire of the U.S. Postal Service. Controversy seems to have surrounded this project like a cloud. From the moment game journalists took a look at the still unfinished software, the word was out. They compared it to such groundbreaking films as Taxi Driver and Pulp Fiction with sophisticated backstory and over-the-top on-screen violence." This is an aside. The dudes at Running with Scissors are obsessed with Pulp Fiction. They constantly name drop Pulp Fiction in their press releases. It's like everybody's comparing them to Taxi Driver and Pulp Fiction. I'm pretty sure Running with Scissors is the only one saying that. I hear a lot of people are saying that our game is like Pulp Fiction. This also began a strategy for Running with Scissors they would utilize time and again, which is basically wait for a public figure or an organization to come out to denounce their deliberately provocative game and then brag about it in their marketing. Now, in addition to this very, very obvious reason of trying to stoke a media controversy for a whole bunch of free press, there was probably another more practical reason for all this bluster. They needed a publisher. They're a small indie company. They obviously can't rely on the old supply chains and things that they had done during their licensed game days, like the Children's Television Workshop and like Hanna-Barbera and all of them. So they need a company who's going to be able to come in and handle the marketing and the distribution and the manufacturing and all that stuff. Because at this point, they're a small nothing company. It didn't take long for them to get a publisher, though. And in late May 1997, Postal found a publisher in Ripcord Games, which was a newly created division of Panasonic. Panasonic probably trying to capitalize again on this interest in violent video games. And maybe they're thinking that Postal might be the next Mortal Kombat or next Doom. But yeah, so Panasonic decides it wants to get into the gaming thing. So they found a company called Ripcord Games, and they pick up Postal as their first title. Panasonic launched a $2 million advertising campaign to market this game, putting out a series of characteristically provocative print ads to sell this game. The ads show a close-up of a person. It's supposed to mimic a TV screen so you can see the scan lines on it. It's supposed to mimic those human interest accounts that reporters at the time loved to collect after violent crimes, particularly those involving suburban white dudes. It's always those, he was such a quiet guy, he kept to himself, and probably because he was in his basement like making bombs or whatever. But in Postal's case, there were two that I've seen. One had an elderly woman with the statement, "He was such a nice, quiet boy." And the one that I have on the screen right now, which is a woman explaining, "We just started dating 3 weeks ago. He seems so happy." And both of them have at the bottom, "What went wrong?" with an image of an assault rifle and the Postal logo. And Panasonic did make a point to say that they were only going to focus on publications that targeted adult audiences. They tried to be very cautious about the fact that this is not something that kids would see. What do you think about this ad campaign?
Interesting. Unlike the games it's comparing itself to, Talking Doom, Wolfenstein, Duke Nukem, it's clearly trying to tell you that the main character, your character, is not a hero, right? Clearly trying to say that there's something wrong. Maybe you're a crazy person, right? Which is interesting.
They're clearly written from the point of view of the perpetrator, and the perpetrator being interesting and getting press and, somebody talking about them on television. So what are the ads establishing? That the perpetrator did something noteworthy, that it's mysterious, that it's worth investigating, and that the perpetrator also somehow has the attention of white women. And also that the perpetrator is not somebody that you as a game player would have to fear, right? Those are all things I read into these ads.
He's just like you. He just snapped. So long as you is a white dude, I think.
Exactly.
I think that's the point to make.
I feel like it's also like, yeah, this is a different perpetrator. Like in all the other options, you're looking at like the He-Man. You're imagining yourself as this ultra masculine, very strong sort of hero, and you're justifying your violence because of some sort of greater good. This is really bringing in more psychological, giving you a psychological feel behind his character. I don't know. There's less trust in his character. There's something wrong here. Maybe there's a part of me that's supposed to be interested in this. I don't know.
Postal also got a nice PR bump at E3 in late June of 1997, with some reports saying that it was one of the highlights of the convention. A report in Consumer Electronics from June the 30th, 1997, described Postal as, quote, one of the most popular exhibits at the show. Their booth also attracted a brief CNN segment, which showed footage from the demo, which showed a trench coat-clad gunman mowing down people while armed with machine guns and rocket launchers. So it got some national press attention too. Postal's demo and its open beta launched on July the 21st, 1997. And Ripcord and Running with Scissors later bragged that over 40,000 people signed up for the beta, and the demo itself had been downloaded, quote, hundreds of thousands of times, end quote. I don't know if that exact number is true, but that's what they're saying, is that a lot of people are downloading this. Now, the demo consisted of the first stage, which allowed players to shoot up a suburban neighborhood. And riding a wave of controversial hype, the game officially released at the end of September in 1997. So let me ask the group then, do you think all the hype, all the descriptions of the so-called software trauma of a game, all the denunciations from the U.S. Postal Service, do we think they were worth it? Was Postal the greatest, most badass game put out by the most radical game makers out there? What do we think about this game?
Good question. This game reaches a segment of American population that I'm not a part of. There is a part of the American population that's driving these type of actions, these mass killings. And it's hard for me to really get a grasp of what the general population will feel out of it because of my background.
Even beyond that, do you think that, like, assuming that the target audience and everything, do they think this game is any good? Like, even beyond the controversial subject, do you think this game is any good?
No. Based on what I've seen, probably not. That having been said, although some companies in their press clippings about how popular their games are, as far as games we've discussed previously on this podcast, some of those people are clearly lying. I would say that their numbers are inflated for Postal, but I actually think a fair number of people probably downloaded this game and tried it out.
Yeah, but how many of them actually, like, it's one thing when you're riding on that wave of hype. It's another thing when you actually play the thing. Like, you can only go so far when the game is an idea. Eventually, it's got to be a product.
It's really hard for me to grasp what the gameplay is going to be like since I've never actually played the game. Just looking down from a top-down shooter, it doesn't look terrible for the 90s from what I'm seeing. But playing it, I'd get a better grasp of how the controls work, if the targeting works well, if the amount of enemies on the screen is balanced so that there's a feeling of challenge, but it's not so overwhelming or impossible. I can't really grasp that from what I'm seeing.
Yeah, it may come as a shock to you that the gaming world did not exactly hoist the makers of Postal on their collective shoulders to thank Running with Scissors from saving them from the likes of Doom and Carmageddon and Duke Nukem and all of them. The critical reception was a resounding meh. A lot of game press gave it 6 out of 10, 60 out of 100, a lot of C's. This was considered okay. Praise for the game generally focused on its sound design. The hand-drawn environments got a lot of praise too. And the kind of just the sheer audacity of the subject matter. However, reviewers across the board called the game dull and repetitive, with really no variety or replay value. And pretty much every reviewer made a comment about the company's shameless attempts to stoke a controversy. People saw what they were trying to do. So, for example, this is Malcolm X. Abram of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution called the game, quote, more a blatant bid for attention than an attempt at a great game. Stephen Redwood of Games Domain concluded, quote, there have been few games over the years which have received more hype and attention than Postal, which is truly a compliment to the game's designers and their marketing department. By relentlessly pushing the violence aspect and highly controversial themes, version, they've succeeded in making a simplistic, mediocre title into one of the most talked about games of the last few months. But now that the cloud of anticipation that we call pre-release is over, Running with Scissors can't hide the simple facts anymore. Violence just isn't enough to make a computer game good. And Richard Law of GameZilla concluded, I would have a dilemma if Postal was a generally solid game. But given that it's pretty much just the same thing over and over again, I can honestly say I don't know why you'd buy this game unless it was to shock your parents, coworkers, or whoever.
I've come up with another review of Postal. Top-down shooters themselves are not something I'm unfamiliar with, and I've played a good deal of them. And they just don't have the appeal that third-person or first-person shooters have. Personally, I found if the top-down shooter turns into a good cooperative experience, the cooperative part of it kind of drives people to play. But in single player, they're just, man, this is after about 25 years after Postal was made of me playing video games. I can think of some of the best gaming experience I've had have been top-down. Well, the best one was probably Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 2, which came out 5 or 10 years after this game. And that was kind of a top-down hack and slash, but still that isometric appeal for shooting, it really doesn't hold you like a third person or first person shooter does. And so I can't fault Postal for that. They were trying something that I can look back with 25 years of perspective, and I would have advised them to go a different route because of all my years of playing and watching one game after the next come out. Even today, top-down shooters are not nearly as successful as other type of shooters.
In anticipation of this episode, I played through the entirety of Postal because it's available for free on GOG.
Oh, God.
What's that?
Why would you do that? Jesus.
Because I am thorough. I am a goddamn professional. And
you are.
The gameplay lasts about 3.5 to 4 hours of total gameplay.
Oh, my God. Are you a different person now? Like, do we need to get you out of the house, go fishing?
We don't want people to come pick you up.
I played it in one sitting because there was no way I was going back to this game. The reviews are absolutely on the mark. This game gets old so goddamn fast.
I don't know why anybody would keep going. I don't know why you kept going, but maybe academically. So
again, because I'm a professional. I wanted to be able to make actual commentary on this. And like, it is the same thing over and over again. It was a slog. The game has no progression. There's no escalation. All this claim of unweaving conspiracy, total lies, total advertising. The closest thing you get to that is there's a still image of it'll have some sort of quotation, and it's supposed to be like playing around with the idea. Is he insane? Is all this really happening? Is it a delusion kind of thing? Other than that, it's just bog standard. I mean, occasionally the game mixes things up by having you maybe shoot at a marching band or an ostrich farm or something. And it's also just a mediocre shooter. Literally everybody's a bullet sponge. It takes tons of hits to take down anybody in this game. And most of the weapons are generally useless. I found myself just going with the starter gun, which had unlimited range and unlimited ammo. It was often the best bet. And on top of everything else, I swear to God, this game is trolling its players by design. So for example, the objective of each stage is to reach a certain kill percentage. You'd imagine that once you get to that threshold, it moves you on to the next level. That's not the case in Postal. You have to hit F1 to move on to the next stage. And there's no indication that you have to do that. So the first couple times I tried playing the first stage, I thought I had broken the game. I thought I had a glitch or something. And good thing GOG has the manual with the game, because I eventually just looked up, what am I missing? And there it was. And it's like, there's no indication in the game itself of what you're supposed to do to move on in it. On top of that, like I said at the outset, the game has a dedicated suicide button, their quit button, which they have mapped to the Q key. Now, this game has what's called a WASD control. Do you guys know WASD control?
Oh, yes. You're talking about the keys on the keyboard.
Yeah. WASD or up, down, left, and right. So the Q button, if you hit Q, he'll say, I regret nothing, and shoot himself and die, and you need to reload the stage. Because there are bunks of jokesters, the Q button is next to the W and the A key. So you'll have more than a few times, which I had, where you're trying to hit up or left and you accidentally kill yourself.
That stinks.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that joke will get old very fast.
It got very frustrating after a while.
So frustration and anger, especially back in the 80s and 90s, already was a big deal because they just didn't know how to make games as friendly to your mind to be able to play them well. But to do that too, oh man, that would be terrible. Are you able to disable that?
I didn't even try remapping the keys. I know that's not something that's particularly common in PC games of that time, but I didn't even try. I was just trying to get through it at that point. I will say that the ending is kind of clever, and I'll just brief spoilers for a game that came out in 1997, which again, I'm not really recommending for anybody. So there are 17 levels. Well, technically they're 16 because when you get to level 7, these all the stages, they have a really generic name. Home, the construction site, the trailer park, the military base. The last stage has a provocative name, the elementary school, which the postal dude goes up into a school. You hear children laughing and shouting. Sprites of kids are running around there. And at this point, control is taken away from the player. And the postal dude just starts, shooting and napalming everyone around them, but nothing happens. And eventually it cuts away and it shows a still image of him locked in a cell and a couple people talking to us. So it gives that idea. Was all this a delusion? Was all this a psychotic break? It's an interesting bit of bait and switch. Now, I know that Running with Scissors has come out pretty clear in emphasizing that games are games and games are not deeper than anything, that they're specifically designed for entertainment and stuff. So they're not really designing specifically in kind of depth, but I thought it was an interesting kind of bait and switch, almost like trolling the player at the end too. Oh, you think you're going to push this boundary? Well, you can't. Nah. Sign Running with Scissors. That's not an original idea for me. There's a great analysis video by a guy named Noah Colwood-Jave, and I'll put a link in the description. He talks about the entire Postal series to date, and he talks a bit about that as well. So yeah, despite the lackluster reception, we'll go about sales and how much this game sold near the end. Postal got some post-release press attention from a pair of extremely likely sources. The first are those determined defenders of values and decency who never let silly things like facts or common sense get in the way of their righteous outrage, moral conservatives. Postal earned a prestigious position on the National Institute of Media and the Family, and there'll be a future episode. They're kind of like a media watchdog group about like things that are objectionable to children in the media. Every year they would release a video game report card, and every year they had a list of like what were the worst games of that year. And Postal made the list for the worst games of 1997, alongside such games as Duke Nukem 3D, War Gods, and Carmageddon. I've not thought about War Gods in a very long time. It also received the attention of another consistent opponent of video games who never failed to make a statement when it came to them, Senator Joseph Lieberman, who during a press event when NIMF, I find it hilarious that their acronym is NIMF, announced their report card, Lieberman declared of all of those games, quote, "These games are not harmless fun, as some suggest. They are in fact digital poison," later adding, "This is sick stuff, and sadly, it sells." And to the surprise of no one, the very next day, Running with Scissors printed Lieberman's comments in a press release, reminding the press that Postal was the game that even Congress doesn't want you to play.
I'm still waiting to hear about a friend of ours.
Oh, Jack Thompson?
What's he up to these days?
I have not found evidence. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I've not found evidence of Jack Thompson ever making a statement about Postal. And he had lots of opinions about other games.
Huh, really?
Yeah.
This seems right on the money for him.
This does come at the very, very earliest stages of his turning his attention to video games. Because I want to say around this time was when the Heath High shooting was, where he decided to sue basically everybody. So it's possible it was off his radar. It's possible he didn't think about it. Or I just haven't come across a quotation.
I was in the same ballpark as Elford because one of the things that Jack Thompson advocated was that video games are murder simulators. And this is quite clearly a mass murder simulator. And this game, I'm venturing to guess, was not popular. So it kind of disproves his theory.
Yeah, you'd think he'd have a lot to say. Yeah, it's basically a murder simulator. It's exactly what he's been warning us about.
And this came out right before the Heath High shooting. And where is it? This sounds like a conspiracy to me.
But anyway, the other group to come out against Postal was the U.S. Postal Service again. So in September of 1997, right around Postal's release, the New Hampshire branch of the U.S. Postal Workers Union denounced the game and called for boycotts. You might also recall a little while ago, I mentioned that the Postal Service threatened to sue. They finally do that now. Now, the reason that they waited so long is a lot to do with trademark law, which I'm not going to talk about here because I'm far from an expert. But on May the 4th, 1998, the United States Postal Service filed a legal opposition against the postal trademark. This sparked a legal battle between the U.S. Postal Service and Running with Scissors that went on for 5 years, which ultimately led to Running with Scissors winning the case in May of 2003. And you better believe that Running with Scissors put out a press release bragging this, saying in a June the 25th, 2003 announcement, quote, "We're pleased with the ruling, although everyone involved knows we never should have had to fight this frivolous lawsuit in the first place. Our game is funny. Theirs is sick." Now, that isn't to say that Running with Scissors did not face financial consequences for their mass shooting game. Numerous retailers, including Walmart, Best Buy, Circuit City, and CompUSA, either refused to carry or pulled the game after its release. And in around December 1997, Panasonic and Ripcord Games pulled their support for Postal. And more on that in a minute. For the most part, Postal rode into stores on a wave of hype, got a bunch of attention, and then faded from public view because, people played the game and realized that it wasn't really that interesting. It was dull. And like, if this is what murder simulators are, then, I'll stick to Doom. I'll stick to fucking GoldenEye, which came out the same year, For the most part, after this, Postal only kind of achieved relevance when interest groups trotted it out as an example of how video games were turning kids into mass murderers. So, for example, it received a brief bump in attention after the Columbine shooting in 1999. But other than that, we got a ton of hype put into sparking a controversy in order to sell an average to mediocre game. Not exactly original fare for scandalous games. However, this all goes back to something that you brought up early on, Phil, that I think there's a more interesting story to Postal than, violent video game makes trouble for the establishment only to turn out to be shitty. And it involves Running with Scissors, because Running with Scissors is still around as of this recording. And over the last 2 decades, the company has gone to great lengths to cultivate a very specific public image for themselves as the coolest, raddest, edgiest dudes in gaming. The same thing they were saying in their first press release, how they're this baddest bunch of badasses. They're still saying it now, as their website says, quote, Running with Scissors is an independent video game studio that develops and publishes outrageous games just for the hell of it, end quote. And the controversy around the first Postal, a game that came out 24 years ago, as of this recording, remains a key centerpiece of the company's image.
So you were making the point that Running with Scissors is still around. So why? What have they come out with in the past 20 years?
I am so glad you asked. So I'm going to bring up Running with Scissors' website, and we are going to go through their game list. They have listed 12 games on their game releases as of this recording. Here we go. Their list. Postal, 1997. Postal Special Delivery, 1998. That was a re-release of Postal, which had a couple more levels. Postal 2, 2003. Postal 2, Share the Pain. That's an expansion of Postal from 2003. Postal 2, Apocalypse Weekend from 2005. Another expansion of Postal 2. Postal Fudge Pack from 2006. Yeah, they're very clever, these guys. That's just a bundle of Postal and Postal 2. Postal 10th Anniversary Collector's Edition from 2007. Postal 3, which actually they've disavowed. Postal 2 Paradise Lost from 2015, which was another expansion of Postal 2 that came out 12 years after the game came out. Postal Redux in 2016, which is another release of Postal. Postal 20th Anniversary Collector's Edition from 2017. And Postal 4 No Regrets, which is still in early access and has been released. So pretty much their entire business model is let's re-release Postal a whole bunch of times.
So how do they afford to do that? Are they selling a lot of units of these games?
Dude, I wish I had an answer to that. The thing that has been baffling me throughout my entire research on Running the Scissors is how they're still in business, because their entire thing is Postal, and like they can't be making that much money off of Postal. I mean, are those Steam sales just that good? Like, they have not had an original title. I'm not counting Postal 4 and I'm not counting Postal 3 because Postal 3 was actually outsourced to a Russian company. But given them the benefit of the doubt, they have not had a new or original game in 18 years. These guys are almost like a dated 90s pop culture reference themselves. And so I'm going to use a dated 90s pop culture reference to give an analogy about them. Running with Scissors is the Al Bundy of the video game industry.
I love Al Bundy.
They peaked in high school. They had like one big play like 30 years ago. They've done nothing with themselves ever since then, but they will never let you forget that one time that they were kind of good. That, I think, is Running with Scissors. Like, they have been riding the coattails of Postal's controversy for almost a quarter of a century.
But how can you do that and be profitable?
I don't know. They baffle me. I don't know how they do this. I don't know how they make money, and I don't know how they stay in business. I honestly do not.
It makes me wonder if the purpose of this was to test to see if there was a market of people that wanted some sort of game where they could do this. Because from listening to your description of the gameplay, I wouldn't have enjoyed it very much. And so all the reviewers were saying they're not enjoying the game very much. So then this idea of taking your violent shooter and taking away the heroic aspect, the sci-fi or fantasy aspect, and then instead just thrusting into you in a world where you're a psycho is testing out whether there's a market of people that just want this. And then am I to imagine that there is? Is that what's supporting Running with Scissors all these years? Why they haven't tried to make anything else?
Dude, wait till we get to Postal 2, because it's leaning into this anti-PC, edgy, we're telling the real jokes that cancel culture won't let us say kind of stuff. And they have definitely carved the niche for that. But again, going back to my point is that Running with Scissors is still around, and they've cultivated a very specific image of this particular game and the Postal controversy. And Postal has kind of achieved a strange level of mythic status for Running with Scissors. Like this, they've re-released it a bunch of times. This is kind of a foundational text for the company, this game. And like any foundational text, there's a certain degree of myth making behind it. So I want to show you 3 examples of myths associated with this game that are pulled from Running with Scissors themselves. Ones that they will tell people and ones that they continue to tell to this day. The first one is actually their oldest, which is how many copies did this game actually sell? I'll preface this by saying that I don't have exact sales figures, but I have kind of like approximations that's some of them sound right and some of them that do not. But I found kind of 2 distinct categories of sales figures when it comes to Postal. The ones that Running with Scissors and Ripcord claimed, and the ones reported by basically everyone else. So for example, if you were to check most industry reports, Postal was at the most a very modest success. A December 8th, 1997 report in Computer Retail Week said that Postal had sold about 9,800 units since its release in late September. A November 4th, 1997 article in the Philadelphia Inquirer reported that Postal had ranked 15th in new release sales and quoted a manager of the King of Prussia Mall electronics boutique who said of Postal, quote, "It's okay, but it's not hot," adding sales from other games blow away Postal. And according even from the game's Wikipedia entry, which cites a PC Gamer article, which apparently also cites a report from the MPD Group, which is a market research firm which keeps track of game sales. So the data should be good. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to see the article itself. According to this article, by the end of 2002, so roughly about 5 years after Postal had been released, the game had sold about 49,000 copies. So really, really modest. Like by comparison, The Curse of Monkey Island came out in November of 1997, so about 2 months after Postal, and sold around 52,000 copies just in 1997. So this is a small game. Unless you asked Ripcord and Running with Scissors, in which case it sold all of the copies. On November 3rd, 1997, Ripcord bragged in a press release that Postal was the 3rd best seller of October 1997, beating out even more established titles like Shadows of the Empire 3D, Hexen 2, Redneck Rampage, Quake, and Tomb Raider, saying, quote, "The country has truly gone Postal over this title. You can't fool hardcore gamers with hype. These early sales results prove that when it comes to nonstop action and kick-ass gameplay, Postal delivers like no other game on the market." In March of 1998, Running with Scissors representatives claimed that Postal had sold over 100,000 copies. Remember I said 49,000? How about 100,000 copies? Or by July, Vince Desi claimed that number had doubled to 200,000 copies. Those are pretty impressive and, in my opinion, suspicious figures given the number of major retailers that either pulled Postal from shelves or refused to carry it at all, especially doubling your sales figures that far out of release.
Okay, so I have a theory here, Kevin. So Running with Scissors was initially incorporated solely to publish Postal, right?
I mean, they were incorporated to publish original games, and it turned out that they only just made Postal over and over again.
Right, but the people involved with that company worked on other games and were involved with other companies, right?
Yeah, like Mike Riddell was the lead publisher on that. He'd been in the industry since the 80s.
Right. So what do we know? This game and this company are probably a loss leader for other games and other titles. I mean, that's usually what's happening with companies where you're like, how does X thing turn a profit, right? RSP could essentially be running on the marketing budget for a larger company. And they put out this game solely to generate press because they know when whenever they put out a new Postal game, it boosts sales for other games that are tangentially related to Postal. So even though RSP isn't making money, the other companies and the other games that these people are associated with are making money.
I don't know that. I mean, that might be the case with Ripcord, the publisher. I think that might be the case. RSP is a weird animal in that because eventually RSP kind of fades away and Running with Scissors replaces it. And like RSP is no longer around. They pretty much die off. I want to say about 99. Like they're not a company anymore. But at the same point, you could say like Ripcord Games did eventually bring in other games under its umbrella and was able to get revenue from them too. So Ripcord's probably making their money off of that stuff, not so much Postal. But hold on to that for a second, because I'm going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about maybe why Ripcord Games doesn't support Postal anymore. But ultimately, I think these figures say that we are looking at a game that was at best a minor success, if it was a success at all. I mean, 49,000 units over 5 years doesn't sound like very much to me. All right, so that's the first one. The second one goes back to our old buddy Joe Lieberman, who's kind of been existing on the peripheries of many of these episodes we do. But this is historical myth number 2. Did Joe Lieberman say that Postal was one of the 3 worst things in America? This is a bit of a segment of the show that's inspired by another great podcast I encourage you to check out called Professor Buzzkill, who tackles historical myths. And he does a whole segment he calls Quote or No Quote. And he'll take a quotation that people associate with a famous historical figure and do the research and say, did they say this real thing? So we're going to play Quote or No Quote with this. So if you read the history of Running with Scissors on their website, you'll come across the following passage. Quote, Running with Scissors knew it was on the right track when Senator Joe Lieberman mentioned the game during his speech on the House floor of the U.S. Senate. He claimed, quote, the worst things in American society are Marilyn Manson, Calvin Klein underwear ads, and the video game Postal. This factoid has been repeated numerous times by Vince Desi and by other Running with Scissors representatives, including on the company's official Twitter. So, for example, from November 16, 2017, said, quote, Joe Lieberman presented Postal to the Senate as a threat to America's youth and called it one of the 3 worst things in American society, the other 2 being Marilyn Manson and Calvin Klein underwear ads. In another blog post on their website, Running with Scissors also added the show When Animals Attack to this list. Speaking of the 1990s, let's talk about When Animals Attack. But did Joe really say this? Did he call Postal one of the worst things in America alongside Marilyn Manson, When Animals Attack, and for some reason, Calvin Klein ads? Those are some really specific references, and we know Joe Lieberman has a history of coming out against video games, even Postal. What do we think about this quotation? We think it's real?
I don't think it's real, but I think it's plausible enough that they could keep repeating it.
So it took me some digging to find this one. The answer is sort of. So the hardest part about this is whenever I try to search for this thing, it often goes back to Running with Scissors itself. They're the ones who keep saying this thing. But as it turns out, I did find what I think it's a reference to. It's actually a misquote of something Lieberman said during a November 6, 1997 Senate hearing on the social impact of music violence. Testifying before the Senate Subcommittee on Oversight on Government Management Restructuring in the District of Columbia, Lieberman explained to his fellow lawmakers that there was a connection between violence in the media and the moral degradation of society. It was a common thing, he said. And it was part of a larger point he was trying to make about the relationship between children's exposure to violence in music, which was the reason for the hearing, and real-life acts of violence. And with that, Lieberman cited several examples of popular media he thought contributed to this alleged moral decay. Among the ones he mentioned specifically were When Animals Attack, Tupac, Marilyn Manson, and Postal. However, I should point out, at no point did he characterize any of them as the 3 worst things in America. Here's the quotation, what he exactly said about Postal in this. Quote, video games like Postal, which is marketed by Panasonic, in which the player is cast as a deranged gunman trying to wipe out an entire town, and the marketing brochure for this video game promises, and I quote, chilling realism as victims actually beg for mercy, scream for their lives, and pile up in the streets, end quote. That's all he said about Postal. If you're curious about the Calvin Klein ad thing, because I was curious about that too, he was concerned that Calvin Klein ads were glorifying drug abuse because he said the models looked like heroin addicts, which was apparently part of a trend in the 90s called heroin chic, which was characterized by models who had extremely thin, like gaunt physique with pale skin, dark under eye circles, and disheveled hair and clothes. So that's what Joe Lieberman had an issue with Calvin Klein, is he thought it was going to encourage people to do heroin. So it's a long way of saying, yes, Lieberman did mention Postal in the same sense as Marilyn Manson. Calvin Klein ads and When Animals Devil's attack, but he never called Postal one of the three worst things in America, despite what Running with Scissors will have you believe. And the final one I'll mention is, why did Panasonic drop Postal? And this one is really fascinating. So I mentioned briefly a few minutes ago that in about December 1997, Ripcord Games and Panasonic, they dumped Postal. They part ways with it. Now, were you to ask Vince Desi and other representatives at Running with Scissors, they will say that Panasonic abandoned Postal because of one man, Howard Stern.
Really?
According to Desi, Panasonic had arranged for Howard Stern to do an ad read for Postal sometime prior to its release on the Howard Stern show. But apparently, Stern misread the copy, saying the game was being made by Panasonic rather than Running with Scissors, which got company executives afraid that people would associate this murder simulator with them and not Running with Scissors, and then prompted the executives at Panasonic to disavow Postal. As Desi explained in a 2017 interview, quote, "Everything was just great until just before the release when Howard Stern did a live radio read of an advertisement and then the shit hit the fan. The overpaid Madison Avenue ad agency, Gray, mistakenly put the Panasonic name instead of Running with Scissors on the client sheet, so Panasonic, the corporate mother of Ripcord Games, basically panicked. Initial orders at major retailers all sold out." Of course they did, Vince. Of course they fucking did, right? But no one reordered as Panasonic pulled the plug, later adding that he felt, quote, "corporate had no balls." This account of things also appears on Running with Scissors' website, which explains in its history section, quote, "The original Postal publisher's parent company, Panasonic Interactive, got cold feet when Howard Stern mistakenly mentioned them by name during an on-air advertisement about the game. Panasonic's label Ripcord Games was summarily spin off into an independent publisher to handle Postal." So that suggests that when Panasonic found out how extreme Postal was, they basically dumped Ripcord, and Ripcord had to handle publishing the game for themselves. What do we think about this claim?
Well, if that was true, I would anticipate them filing a lawsuit against this. I guess it's the marketing company say they made an error. That's a big, big problem for their company.
Yeah, but it's not really libel if Panasonic is distributing the game.
No, not libel, but rather if they believe that the marketing company made a mistake, which caused the person on the radio to say things incorrectly, I would think they would have filed a lawsuit. Seems like in all of this, people have had no problems filing lawsuits when they feel aggrieved. That's the way I would test the truthfulness of this statement. Did they file a lawsuit?
Oh, I like it.
So did they file a lawsuit against the marketing company?
Yeah, I think all of this is false, by the way. I think that you make a good point, Elford, that like this would be a reason for Panasonic to say sue their marketing if they're giving the wrong copy and that's misrepresenting the company or whatever. But I've looked this up a bit. Now, I have not been able to find an ad read from the Howard Stern show that would corroborate that whether or not he did the read or not. But I have had evidence of Consumer Reports and press releases and things. And I found that according to accounts from the time, Ripcord remained supportive of Postal through most of its retail run. And I found representatives from Ripcord defending Postal as late as early December 1997, which would suggest that Ripcord was still holding on to them almost 3 months after the game's release. The other thing is when the initial announcement dropped that Ripcord Games was picking up Postal, they made it no mystery it was a division of Panasonic. And a lot of the pre-press accounts about Ripcord Games mentioned that they were Panasonic. It wasn't a mystery that Ripcord was a division of Panasonic. So it would not have been a shock. And the other thing about this, like, it would not have been a shock to sort of the gaming market in general that this is Panasonic, number one. Number two, it's like the question of who is getting offended by this. I mean, Howard Stern show listeners are not exactly known for their moral conservatism. They're not known to be easily squeamish about things that are morally objectionable. They're listening to fucking Howard Stern. And it's like, if anything, they'd be like, oh, that's cool. That game sounds like something that's up our alley. Like, the more you think about this, the less it makes sense. And let's tackle the other part of that. And again, from accounts I've seen, it seems that Ripcord dumped Postal sometime around mid-December. I saw a report from March of 1998 that said that Ripcord dropped Postal a couple of months ago. And I've seen at least one thing of support from early December. So that leads me to believe that Ripcord drops Postal around probably mid to late December 1997, January 1998. So they definitely didn't drop them before the game release. That's patently false. The other part of that argument that Panasonic dumped Ripcord and Ripcord had to support Postal on their own is also false, because reports from the time talk about Ripcord being a division of Panasonic for a while after that. I will say Panasonic did drop Ripcord in 1999. So a full 2 years after Postal had kind of come and gone. And the reason for that is Panasonic was just getting out of the games industry, and Ripcord did spin off into its own company and stuck around briefly before officially folding in 2001. So this top to bottom is absolutely patently false. None of this is true, but it is a very useful myth for Running with Scissors because it allows them to say, you know, we're the ultimate independent game company. And they're like, we don't need anybody's influences. We do this all on our own. We make games because we feel like it, and we'll do whatever we want, whatever the man of the suits say. And the suits decided to drop Postal, and we made it anyway because we're making the games we feel like, and fuck your feelings and all that. The lesson, I think, a lot of Running with Scissors marketing is extremely self-serving. Anytime you hear stuff from representatives like Vince Desi, you have to take it with a massive grain of salt. It's always in service of this image of Running with Scissors. This does not stop Running with Scissors from spinning this whole thing about being dropped into a positive. They claim on their website, even as that Postal was quote unquote blacklisted in America, that between being pulled from retailers and like being dropped by their company, and even that's really sus. Like if I were to make a guess of what happened, I think Ripcord took a chance on Postal thinking that they were going to be the next big controversy. And this small company, relatively small investment, you put in $2 million and maybe you get a huge return on that. And maybe you're able to ride a lot out of the small company. And I think they were able to ride a wave of hype. But then when the game came out, it really didn't sell that well. And by December, I think that they were willing to cut their losses. And, you know, this was an experiment we tried. It was a failed experiment and we didn't sell that much. And that even goes into like the retailers who pull Postal, I think is the same thing. Because like CompUSA is a good example. CompUSA announced it was pulling Postal in November of 1997. At that point, Postal had been out for about a month and a half. I think what happened is that the retailers saw that this game was not selling well, was not going to sell well, and then turned it into a PR spin of their own. That we're doing corporate responsibility here. We realize this game is objectionable. As CompUSA's CEO said, apparently the game, quote, didn't pass the smell test. But apparently they came to this decision almost a month and a half after the game had been out. I think if this game was selling well, they would have made every reason to keep it. Mortal Kombat is a good example. Mortal Kombat got tons of negative press and a lot of controversy, but it sold like gangbusters in 1993. And not a single retailer that I found pulled this game from shelves. Whereas many of them, like Toys R Us and KB Toys, announced they were pulling Night Trap. Night Trap was selling significantly worse than Mortal Kombat. I think if this game was making people money, people would have kept investing in it. And I think that was the case of both the retailers and Ripcord Games. And I think that's the reason why they dropped this game. It wasn't from Howard Stern. It wasn't that this game was too extreme. It wasn't that this game was blacklisted in America. It's that people weren't buying your shitty game. That's what happened. That's what I think.
That makes sense. Sorry, Running with Scissors.
Yeah.
So if this is the case, then you can see Postal as ultimately a failed experiment in controversy marketing. And edgy marketing and controversy baiting will only get you so far if the game isn't any good. That's my thought on it. Final thoughts on Postal?
I think it's wild that a game could exist like to help everyone manage their optics and never actually exist for the purpose of people enjoying it as a game. It's like it was created and incepted because engineers were tired of doing family-friendly content, and it was marketed under the guise that it was something that should cause a moral panic. And then it persisted because it allowed people to say that they were fighting against the establishment, and people pulled it so that they could say that they were doing the right thing by their customers. Like at no point is anybody making any type of value judgment about, hey, let's make this game better.
Postal is interesting. It's a game that came and went completely under my radar, and yet a movie was made about it, which I learned of course, since we did our episode on Uwe Boll, which tells me that there are people that it means something to. It's a conundrum. It's still being produced and still being maintained, but it didn't make a very big impact on the video game evolution going forward. So why is it still around? I feel like there's a bigger conversation here when it comes to that this game touches on even closer than many of the other games when it comes to violence, video games, and maybe our motivations for playing video games.
Postal mostly is more an idea than a game. It becomes, for say, moral conservatives. This is why we need to do something about video games. This is why video games are warping our children and all this stuff. This is what Jack Thompson is railing about, that, this is what's causing their impressionable minds to be changed and becoming serial killers and psychopaths and things like that. And on the other hand, you've got people who are like, this is the idea of the ultimate assertion of free speech. And isn't that a very American thing, that we assert our free speech through our consumerism? And this idea, I'm going to buy this thing to show the establishment that I matter and this kind of things matter. You can't tell me what games I'm going to like. But what's fascinating about that is even in the Steam reviews, because this is a company where like it was definitely a fake it till you make it kind of thing, because they do okay in part because Steam sales seem respectable enough and are able to exist in a game market that is decentralized, that even the people who put positive Steam reviews of Postal will point out parts where the game isn't particularly good and complain about things like the control is not good and the game gets old. And even for the people who play it and give positive reviews, even now, it is an idea. And sometimes that's more powerful than an actual thing you look at. And that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave a rating on iTunes. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Seek Me by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NC SA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizeri.
I'm Elford Stevens.
And I'm Phil Thomas. Although the game Postal did not serve a purpose, you know what does? Your local post office. Be sure to go out there and support the U.S. Postal Service.
Words to live by. Thank you, Phil. And thank you for listening. And we'll see you next Scandal.